you so much for coming to the Hagood Meal today. We have a lot of fun out here. As you can see, we're dressed in our period costumes, and we wanted to let y'all know what the kids had to do back then, what kind of chores they had. And the first thing in the morning, just like today, we have to have our coffee in the morning. So the kids always came out and got the water. And so if somebody will prime our pump, okay, you have to take the water and put it in the top. Will one of y'all prime the pump for her, please? Yeah, you have to take the water and put it in the top to prime the pump. Now remember, sometimes there's snow on the ground when you've got to come out and do this. It's not, and I know the water's cold today too, but if you're going to take a bath, you have to prime the pump and get the water going. Go, push hard, all the way down. There you go. Then you'd fill the bucket, and you'd have to run it into the house because that's what gets the whole morning started. You've got to have the water. Okay, that's good. Just think though, if you've got 10 people in your family, hold it out, come on. If you've got 10 people in your family and you're going to be bringing the water in for baths, you have to fill up the whole tub. Okay, we can set the bucket down over here so that it goes off. Remember, if you were filling up a whole tub for the whole family to take a bath, you'd have to fill the whole tub. Now, the dad takes the bath first, then mom, and then every kid, it gets young. So by the time it gets to the youngest kids, that's some pretty dirty water. But that's how we took baths back then. The other things that we had kids help with is it was age appropriate. So if you were really small, you couldn't carry firewood, but you could churn the butter. And what would happen is we'd put all the ingredients in here for our butter, and it has to stay continuously going. So one of the smaller kids could stand on the end and constantly swing the butter churn. Now that doesn't sound like a really hard job until you've been doing it for 2 or 3 hours. Now you had your chores to do, but your brothers and sisters have their chores to do too. So this would be your job. And you might only be about this tall, but you had to stand and churn the butter all day. The other things that had to be done, clothes washing. This is a really great invention. Before we had a clothes washer, you'd have to take a washboard down to the creek and scrub out the clothes on the washboard. And that was really hard on everybody's knuckles, rubbing that up on there, and you'd rinse all the clothes out in the creek. But this high-fangled washing machine came along in the 1800s, and you could wash your clothes. But now one of the little bit bigger kids would have to stand here and constantly move the clothes, just like it does in a washing machine. Because you didn't want the clothes to sit and get sedentary, you'd keep moving them back and forth. Now as they got bigger, the bigger kids would take the clothes out of the water and put it in a bucket where you'd gone and got more water from the well and rinse those clothes out. And then you would put the clothes in here and you would have to turn the handle and squeeze the clothes through to get the extra water out. Because if you hung those soaking wet clothes up, it's going to take them a while to dry. But when they came through here, it would squeeze all the excess water out and that would get the clothes drier quicker. Now usually 2 girls would be doing this job just because they have the boys out doing something else in the fields or picking up. One of the things that the boys really didn't like was picking up rocks. When you're plowing up a field and you're going down through there and planting it, you can't keep running over the rocks. So the boys would have to pick up the rocks and throw them out of the field. And so that was a lot of walking back and forth on the boys, but here you are, you got the job doing laundry because they'd never leave the boys doing laundry. Chores were a very girls' chores and boys' chores. Laundry has always typically been the girls' chores. But if they've got all the boys working out in the field, when it comes time to bring in the firewood, the girls would need to fill up the firewood rack. So you'd have to gather the firewood, which your mom wants done. Gather the firewood and bring it back over here and put it in the firewood rack. Now you had to have fire almost constant because you had to keep the fire going. We had to have fire to build to keep the cabin warm, but your mom was probably constantly cooking over the fire. So the boys would be splitting the wood, you would be hauling it back and forth and getting it to the house. And this is a job that had to be done practically constantly because the fire burned almost constantly. And the last thing you do before you went to bed at night was make sure that the firewood was stacked up to get it going in the morning. What else is always falling typically as a woman's job? Everybody had to sweep and clean and get the floor cleaned up. If we had a nice long line out here, we would be hanging out all our clothes to dry, and you would always have to be careful of which way you swept the porch, because you couldn't be sweeping the porch where the wind would pick it up and blow it on your freshly laundered clothes. Because if you're getting the clothes dirty again, you're just going to have to wash them again. And another about the cabins with the smoke going, the fireplace is built in a special way so that the fire, you have to be able to cook over it. And you want that fire to cook a pan of cornbread all the way through. So it's a special kind of fireplace that holds the heat in so that it gets hot enough in there to cook all the way through. When it holds the heat in, it also holds the smoke in. Like the new houses we have now, they have a flue and you can get the smoke to go out. But in these fireplaces, you didn't. So the whole cabin would fill up with smoke. So a lot of times, another job that people forget about is you had to blow the smoke out of the house so it wouldn't get so bad you couldn't breathe in there. So a lot of times kids were put at the doors just to blow the smoke out of the house and keep the house from getting too smoky. But everybody smelled like smoke. Your clothes, if you met at church on Sundays or if you went to the mill to get your corn ground, everybody's clothes smelled like smoke. So everybody smelled like smoke because it was a constant back then, something you had to do. So you had to be careful when you were outside, when you were in the yard. Make sure that nobody got too close to the clothesline and messed the clothes up. Something we don't think about now, not only blowing dirt on it, but we had chickens. And it was usually the ladies' job to take care of the chickens. They kept the chickens because they kept the eggs. And as soon as the chickens quit laying, they became dinner. So they covered up two things that you really need, not to mention the feathers. The feathers were used to make pillows for the beds. So if you killed an animal, you tried to use every part of it because it was good for something. But the chickens laying the eggs was one of your most valuable resources. So you had to be careful when you got the eggs. Not only if you had enough chickens and you had extra eggs, the extra eggs were something that your family could trade and maybe get flour or sugar, something that they couldn't make themselves. So you could use those extra eggs like money and trade them in to other families and for stuff that you needed. And that worked out really well. But it was your job to make sure the chickens got fed, they got water, and you had to clean that chicken coop out. So it has to be kept clean in there so they can get around. Did y'all have any questions? None so far, huh? Okay. Now, the chores that we talked about everybody doing, those are chores that you had to keep up with. But also, you have to think chores, like I said, were age appropriate. So one of the biggest chores that girls your size had were taking care of the little kids and making sure they were getting their chores done and that they were getting dressed and they were getting cleaned up every day. So babysitting was one of the biggest chores that y'all would have had, is taking care of the younger ones. As the younger ones come along, you would grow up into different chores in the family. And that was something that kids took a lot of pride in. So that like when you were big enough to do certain chores, it was kind of like a milestone, like going from a one grade to the next. You were moving up and becoming a grown-up, a bigger person, because you knew how to do more of the chores and more to do that would help around the house. One thing that they used to do that I used to think was so silly, was they would sweep the yard. But why would you sweep the yard, like outside? A lot of times the yards were just dirt, but it was a sign of taking care of your home. If somebody came to visit you, you didn't want a lot of stuff laying out in your yard. You wanted to be a nice, clean area that looked clean and neat and was well cared for. And so they would send you out to sweep the yard and keep the place clean, because everybody took a lot of pride in what they had, and they took care of what they had. If you went and got the water in the mornings and you filled up the water buckets, you didn't just throw that bucket back down. You set that bucket down easily, because you're going to have it again. Tools were very important to them back, and it was hard to get these things when you had to make them yourself. So you took a lot more care of things, I think. And remember, you only had at the most 2 different sets of clothes. So you might have on the clothes and you might have Sunday clothes. But you didn't have a whole lot of clothes so that you would be out playing or running around. You were very careful with your clothes. It wasn't something that you took lightly. If you fell down and skinned your knee and tore your pants, those had to be sewed up right away before the tear got bigger. So there's a lot of things that the kids did back then that we don't do now, but they still had plenty of time to get together and play and have fun, but only after all the chores were done. Another thing that everybody had to have back then was their own garden. So the garden took a lot of time to plant, and you kept your seeds from one year to the next so that you would have something to plant the next year. And it was always closer to the house so that they could keep pests out, because you had to worry constantly about raccoons or deer getting into your garden. And that was your food that your family had to eat. It wasn't like you could run to the grocery store and get it. So they spent a lot of time pulling up the weeds in the garden, and the kids could do this. That was their job, and they recognized what was a weed and what was a vegetable and what had to be done. Now when it started to come in and the garden started to produce the vegetables, Mom would probably come out and make sure which ones were right and which ones weren't, but it's a learning curve for you, because you're going to be the one that has to decide which one's ripe and which ones aren't from now on. And you have to be able to teach. That's another big thing that y'all would have to do. You also had to teach what the jobs were to your younger siblings and all. So it was your job, if you were older, to teach, and if you were the youngest coming up, your job was to learn. So it wasn't as easy back then, because there were so many jobs to do and so many things to be divided up, but you worked together as a family, because it took the whole family and all the kids to get things done. Unless you were just a baby that couldn't even walk yet, you had chores. And there's a lot of them. Now, the garden, they would have to put these things up to last them for all winter. So you would also learn how to hang, which vegetables needed to hang to dry out so that you could use them, and spices, which one dried out, which ones you could use, and which ones had to be kept in a cold storage. And a lot of times what they'd do is they would dig under the house a place where they could put in maybe onions or potatoes, and it kept them really cold, kind of like our refrigerators are now, so they would last longer. So you would have to get things ready for storage too, because it had to be really dry down there. And you know how dirt gets damp. You had to make sure that they stayed in buckets or pots or something that would keep them from getting that dampness in them so they didn't rot.